Hi, this is Joe Chambers. Welcome to Musicians Hall of Fame Backstage, the Vault Series. Today's clip was shot back in January of 2005 in Los Angeles. I went to Mike Poe Studios and met up with legendary producer Jimmy Bowen. Jimmy produced the Rat Pack, Dean Martin, Sammy Davis, and of course Frank Sinatra. Matter of fact, the first song I ever danced to was a Jimmy Bowen production, Strangers in the Night. Jimmy made such a name for himself, he came to Nashville and virtually turned the recording industry upside down, updating all the studios and really started cutting. It went from a cottage industry into a huge multi-million, billion-dollar industry. Jimmy produced some of my favorite country records on George Strait, Reba McEntire, of course Hank Williams Jr. Hope you enjoy it. If you do, be sure to hit like, subscribe, and the notification bell so you don't miss any of our new content. Once again, record producer Jimmy Bowen.
I started in 1956. We had a band in college. We had an electric guitar player, Don Lanier, known as Dirt, and Buddy Knox and I. And we recorded our first record at Clovis, New Mexico at Norman Petty Studios. And that's where I first kind of got the taste of production. I loved the way Norman Petty worked. Buddy Holly and the Crickets were recording there at not the same day, but the same time. And that's back when they had one mono machine. Now, I never recorded direct to disc, but we had one mono machine. If you didn't get it right, you did it over. Just this evening, I've been working in a new thing called Pro Tools, digital. I don't even know how many tracks I have, but I haven't run out at 100. Of course, I'll be here a long time. So I've seen that technology go, like the Wright brothers in the 747 or the Jets. And the same thing with the players. I've had the chance to work with and watch the electric bass go from stand-up bass to electric bass, and the virtuosos that came on the electric bass over the last 30, 40 years. Joe Osborne was my favorite electric bass player probably ever. And when I worked out here, he worked for me. When I lived in Nashville, he worked for me. There's a guy that certainly deserves to be in the Musicians Hall of Fame. Lee Scalar, who took what Joe did and took it to the next level. I learned how to use this instrument more and more, and it was allowed to be more thematic and melodic. When I worked out here, I used to love to work with Hal Blaine. He could take a 50-piece orchestra and kick it in the butt better than anybody I've ever seen. I went from Hal to a Larry London in Nashville, who I just loved, the big bad kid, and he could play those drums. And you can't name them because there's dozens of each instrument, but just certain ones come to mind. Guitar players. I mean, I worked with from Barney Kessel out here to Reggie Young in Nashville. My favorite guitar player of all time, electric, was Reggie Young. He's just amazing. I worked with Reggie a few months ago, and he was still just beautiful and playing like he was 25 years old. When I first moved to Nashville, it was when I first was introduced to a lot of instruments. When I worked in pop music, I never used a steel guitar, hardly ever. I hardly ever worked with a banjo or a mandolin or one fiddle. My first album in Nashville I was producing Mel Tillis. Mel showed up with a guy with him, and I said, "What's he do?" Mel said, "He's a fiddle player." And I said to myself, "Where am I going to put him? The room's full." So I said, "I'm going to get even with Tillis." I put him in the vocal booth with Mel. After about 10, 15 minutes, Mel said that, "Bowen, can you overdub this boy?" I said, "I certainly can." The first time I did this one fiddle, I didn't know how to mic the fiddle. I always had 20 violins, you know. But then I got to work with a guy named Johnny Gimbel. And it was so beautiful. And he followed the melody, and the artist just knocked me out. And there's more than that. But I learned how that instrument worked by itself, you know. I worked with Buddy Emmons on steel. J.D. Manis out here a little, but I never used a steel. Buddy, and then through Buddy up to Paul Franklin I'm sure I've been retired 10 years. There's probably a whole new group of kids down there that are just kind of taking it a little further, a little further. So to see these guys get some recognition is absolutely marvelous, because all the success I ever had is because I had a good artist and a good song and great players.
Jimmy, when did you first decide that you wanted to be involved in music? Do you remember what age it was?
I decided that music is what I wanted to do when I was a junior in high school. And my buddy had bought a guitar and it drowned out my ukulele. We were just goofing around, so I got me a guitar and then he got an electric guitar. And they had an assembly at school. And we did a couple songs. And the girls, you could just, I looked out and I went, whoa, this is it. Obviously, I meant it on a higher level of communicating with people. But I said, that's it. And I just knew from that moment on.
And when did you pick up a bass?
Well, we were three guitars in high school. We wound up a trio, three guitar players. We went to college. One of the guitar players got married and went away. We wound up with two guitar players, and they needed a bass. I think they needed the bass because there wasn't a very good guitar player. And back then, it was a stand-up bass, and slapped it as much as it was the drums and the bass. And we weren't playing country. We thought we were rock and roll. And you couldn't hear if I hit the right notes or not. So they kind of stuck me back there. We were on the road a couple years later, and the Fender sent us this marvelous, one of the first Fender electric basses. And I just sat and looked at it for a day. I finally took it on stage, and the next week we hired a bass player. Because I couldn't understand it this way. I understood it this way. I didn't understand it this way. So then I went back and played rhythm guitar. But I think one of the reasons I love to produce records, and that was such a kick for me, because I didn't have to do that. But I had these great people, these great players, that could just. I used to play with, there was a guitar player out here, Tommy Tedesco, one of the most incredible readers I've ever seen. You could sit down any piece of music in front of this man, and the first time he plays it, everyone perfect. He just flew. He was amazing. So I had those kind of players and jazz players, and but to get to receive it done incredibly well is absolutely wonderful.
Well, you had a career too, though, as a singer.
Yeah, I was a teenage idol in 1957 for about 6 months, and it worked great for the first 6 months because we had a hit record, and the girls screamed so they couldn't hear if I was in tune or not. And I sing about an eighth of a tone flat, but I can do it for hours. The only problem is I can hear it better than that. And after about 6 months, the screams died down, and I knew I better find another way to make a living.
So what was your first job as a producer?
Glenn Campbell and I, in 1961 and 2, we were signed to American Music, a publishing company on the West Coast. And we did all the demos for all the writers. And that's the first time I'd love when I saw Norman Petty do our stuff. The first time I got to get in there and start to get involved in the producer role. And I loved it. And that's when I said, that's what I want to do. And then...
How did you learn to do that?
Well, it was kind of like the Wright brothers. Now, back then, you didn't have a board with 100 inputs and 87. It was a very simple form. And of course, the key to all of it is the music, and you're not making that. You're supposed to guide it, receive it, know when it's wonderful, know when it needs something, and you have to know how to assemble the right musicians together to create that. I mean, you do a mismatch in the rhythm section, and you're dead. You're not going to accomplish anything. And I learned that in the demo process. I'd had the wrong musician every now and then, and pretty soon it dawned on me that this is an art form, and one ought to learn it real well. So then I went through the process for many years learning it.
And so what was your first major artist or major hit that you produced?
In In early 1964, I produced a song with Dean Martin, Everybody Loves Somebody. And later it got released in the late summer of that year. And it just, it was out for 2 or 3 months, nobody touched it, and then all of a sudden it exploded. And that was the first one, the key one. And Dean was my favorite artist I've ever worked with.
So you started out as a producer. Your first hit was "Everybody Loves Somebody Sometime," and that's a standard forever. You know, I mean that's.
Yeah, it was. And I was 26, 7 years old. I didn't know. I had no idea what the scope of any of that was. I was just. I loved Dean Martin. When I was growing up, I loved his music, and here I have a chance to do him. And all I did different was I had a 45-piece orchestra, large string section, and background singers. But the thing I did different, I took the young rhythm section in L.A. then and put it there. And Ernie Freeman did most of those arrangements, and he was a magnificent arranger. He could tune to an artist, and you could work with Ernie, and you'd get what the two of you talked about. But I wouldn't let him write any parts out for the rhythm section. I wanted that to be feel, and everything else written out. And that I thought was the secret to that. Again, of course, it was a great song, fit the times, accidentally, but just putting the two together, the young and the guys that he used to work with, it kind of worked.
How did Sinatra come about?
Well, he owned Reprise, and I was head of A&R for Reprise, and that's why I was doing Dean Martin. And they were good buddies, great buddies. And Sinatra called me after I'd had half a dozen hits with Dean, 3 or 4. Sinatra called me over to his office. He said, "I like what you've been doing with the Dago." He meant Dean. He said, "What would you do with me?" And I said, "Well, I wouldn't bastardize you. I'd just change the music around you. You still have to be you." And that, thank God, was the right answer. And I had a song called "Softly as I Leave You" in my good song file, and I brought that over. I played it for him. He said, "All right, no problem." And we went in the next week and did it. And when we got the take, in those days we listened out in the big studio to the big speakers. It was in there listening. It was just beautiful. It's a beautiful song. We finished. He said, "Well, James, what do you think?" I said, "I think it's about a number 30 record, but it'll get us back on the charts, and then we'll have a big one." Those steely blue eyes looked at me. He just turned and left the studio. That's not the answer he wanted to hear. I don't know why I said it. I always knew with Sinatra you better deal honest and frank and don't dance, you know. And the record went to, I think, 29. So that saved me. So then we never had any problems ever. But from then on, okay, the kid knows what he's talking about. And then we had Strangers in the Night, which was a worldwide record.
First song I ever danced to.
Strangers in the Night.
That was it.
And that Strangers in the Night was another beautiful combination of all the elements. Then we had a song, my favorite one with Sinatra I did was called "That's Life." It's the only record I ever had anything to do with. It went #1 in the Cashbox R&B chart. It went #1 everywhere, but in Cashbox R&B, I always liked that.
Who's some of the other guys you worked with here in L.A. before you took off to Nashville?
Well, during that era at Reprise, it was Sinatra, Martin, Sammy Davis Jr. That was a marvelous experience for about almost 3 years. There was so many artists. I worked with the old the old nightclub singer group of guys, the Vic Damone, Buddy Greco. I cannot remember them all. There were so many that I did albums and stuff with. It was kind of like Frank Buck, you know, Bring 'Em Back Alive, because I got so lucky with Dean and then with Frank. And that was a wonderful era. But about that, actually, all this was going on while the Beatles were happening and all, so it was really kind of a left field thing. But then the heavy metal came in, and I tried a couple groups, you know, and at the end of 6, 7 days recording, we're still working on an 8-bar intro of the first song. Everybody's on a different drug, just kids, you know, but they were creating something, but I didn't have the patience to watch it through. It takes 6 months or a year. And we used to do our albums in 2 weeks. You could do an album in a week if you were in a hurry. So that's when I went to Nashville.
So that was, what year was that?
I went to Nashville. Actually, I moved to Arkansas in June of '76, and I started driving into Nashville or flying into Nashville and just looking it over and seeing what the lay of the land was, because I didn't follow country music when I was in pop music, not from a business standpoint, and only a few records did I get to hear, you know.
What was in Arkansas?
It was a good place to stop on the way to Nashville. Nashville was back then was if you came to visit, they're the most gracious people in the world. Of course, I'd be hunting songs from Martin or different people, so I got to know all the publishers and writers. But if you just come moving into Nashville, then you were a carpetbagger. So I went to Arkansas first and just eased my way in. So I knew what it was, because you just kind of walk into it, and usually from New York, LA, you walk in like we know it and you don't. You're dumb hillbillies. Of course, they weren't dumb hillbillies. So it had to give me a chance to just come around. I got to know a lot of hang out with writers and publishers, find out who were writing the great songs and who the musicians were then. And then I think it was '78, I took over MCA down there. It was just the labels down there then were really not labels; they were like outposts. You know, they have a small staff, and I changed that because I knew there was millions to be sold, because millions of Americans, when the heavy metal came in, they didn't have anything to listen to. And I knew if this country music sharpened up, if they took more time with it, made albums instead of singles, that you could sell millions. And that's kind of what I set out to do. We had to improve a lot of things, like the technical side, the studios. We had to update a whole lot of things. But when I first went down there, I remember they didn't want many drums on the record, you know. We were at the Grand Ole Opry in 1957. They wouldn't let a drummer bring his stuff in, you know. But all these millions of people who've grown up, that was our consumer, they grew up on drums. And to turn on country music, if there's no drums, they automatically will go left to that. So we had to introduce drums. We had to make it all right to put on string sections if you wanted to. It's all right to do anything, because a country artist is a country artist. You got to really work hard to un-country a great country artist, you know.
Reba was your first major act on them?
You know, when I went to Nashville, the first artist I produced down there was Tom Paul and the Glazer Brothers before I moved. After I moved there, Mel Tillis asked me to come and work with him. And there's some great stories about me. Of course, anything I had to do with Mel Tillis is absolutely hilarious. I did Mel first. For ABC down there, I did Red Steagall and Roy Head. A couple of real great records with Roy Head. And I'm sure I'm missing some people here. And then the first artist that broke huge in platinum was Hank Williams Jr. That was a great period. I don't know, must have done 8 or 9 albums in there. Each one was great fun.
And did you do the Country Boy Can't Survive album and all that?
The first one I did was Family Tradition, and then Country Boy was the second album.
So that was 79, wasn't it?
Probably 70, yeah, 79. And that was great, and that was a great period. He was just, so much of it, being a producer, so much luck, because he was ready then. And after he had the accident falling off the mountain, he sang different. He had to hear what he was doing, because he had damage to his ears. And all of a sudden, from that pretty voice as of a kid, came out this hard, biting, almost rock and roll voice, but country person, you know. And he wrote some great songs. And then I got to work with George Strait.
I went on the road with Hank for a while. Actually, I produced the Bama Band. I got them a record deal on Complete,
Right.
with Charlie Fash. And so I went out on the road with them. That was the most amazing thing at that period of time. He was as big a rock star as any rock star. It was scary to be on stage when he walked out on stage.
Yeah. He had a real great hot period. Ran pretty long too. He was, and that was good because, you know, country goes in cycles. It's country, and it gets slicker, 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 and then it goes back and gets country, and it gets slicker, slicker, slicker. And it was just perfect time for, it was getting pretty slick at that time. And he broke through. And then I wound up over at MCA, and I got to work with George Strait. And he, you know, you talk about a number A1 person. He's an absolutely marvelous guy. And I had some great success with George, and then Reba. At first, Reba was working with a couple other producers, and I had some great stories with Reba. And, you know, you can't remember them all, but it's great fun. And we never got her to do that. Whoever's in New England, Reba's fear was getting slick. She wanted to get to be Reba. And before, she usually just, here's your songs, come in and sing them, and we'll let you know when it's finished. And I of course, don't, I don't like to do that. I think if you're ever going to really reach the public, it has to be the artist's record, the artist's music, that all great people should help them make, but it should be them, you know. So I made her come in to do her own sweetening, put her steel guitar on, this and this. I said, you got to learn. You got to learn what this process is. And she's so sharp. Oh, what a very smart woman. And she had that like that, you know. And you can tell by what she did, she realized not just make records and tour, she does Broadway, she does television. I mean, she's an entertainer that happened to be a country artist, you know.
And she is truly a country artist too, for real. Did Mr. Foglesong, or did you sign Garth to the label?
Foglesong. Tony, he auditioned for Tony Brown and I was moving from Universal over to Capitol. I was kind of in limbo where I couldn't sign anything, but Tony and I both that day, when he sang for us, thought he was too pop. And after he left, my wife has an office in the next room. She walked in and said, now, who was that? And I told her Garth, but she said, he was good. And neither one of us did anything, and then he wound up playing that little club down there, the Writers Play. And
Bluebird?
Lynn Schultz was head of A&R at Capitol, and everybody in town passed on Garth. And Lynn went to see him at the Bluebird and was knocked out, and went back and told Foglesong, got to sign him, got to sign him. Of course, that's the best piece of advice anybody ever had. And of course, I was lucky enough to come in, and there he was. You know, and all we had to do was let people know he existed. You know, Garth was a very complex, intelligent. He had a degree from college in, I think, marketing. He understood. He's the only artist I've ever seen since Sinatra that controlled his own life 100%. I mean, he negotiated with lawyers. He had people around him. I mean, Garth was in control the whole time. It was quite an amazing thing.
That was, and there again, when something like that happens, that was great for everybody.
Sure. Absolutely. Anytime something big happens in any genre of music, it draws people to the genre, not just the artist. So a lot of people benefit, you know.
At one time, you had such a stable of artists, you could hardly produce them all. Was that right?
It was all I could do to produce the ones I produced.
Did you have some helpers at all?
I built up after 6, 7 years, I had a huge group of people, creative people on the technical side. I had one guy that I grew up with who was a guitar player in our band years ago. The guy, Dirt, he wouldn't be known as anything but Dirt. And he was, his job was songs. And he worked with all the writers and publishers in town and the artists. See, I co-produced with my artists because I wanted them to be involved in the total process. If they get involved in the total process and it happens, they'll know how to parlay it, how to keep it. They know why it happened. It wasn't magic, it was because certain things were done. And Dirt would take the artist, he'd listen to the writer's songs all the time, but then he and the artist would sit and listen to 50, 100 songs, whatever it was. Sometimes the artist would go with him to the songwriters, to the publishers. And then they would come to me with the 20 songs they really liked the best. And then the three of us would go through them and decide how many we had for radio And I always thought an album should be a show. I mean, if I put it on, I want to be entertained like I saw you in person. So it ought to have an opening, and it ought to have peaks and valleys, and it ought to close. So we always tried to pick a few songs that we knew were radio, but the rest I called piece of business songs that made it a good entertainment package. And the three of us did that. Excuse me. So I wasn't out hunting songs all the time, which is almost a full-time job, you know. So that's one way I could do more projects. And as I started doing more all the time, I got 3 different studio owners to fix the studios the way I wanted them, and I guaranteed them business to do that because we had to upgrade our technology. And I wanted them to be the same so I could move from one to the other and not have to relearn what I'm listening to or what I'm touching, you know.
What studios were they?
Soundstage, we had a couple there. Emerald, when they upgraded Emerald, I worked with them to do that so we'd have the same kind of equipment we had in the other. And I had Soundstage the last few years. They built me a big studio with no wall between the control room and the musicians. And that's the most fun I ever had in the studio, because I just have a bass player sitting over to my left and the drummer's right over here and the guitar player's here. We were all in one room. And we worked in headphones. Of course, we worked in headphones, so couldn't have our speakers going. And Masterphonics was the third one. And all 3 studio owners were creative people mostly, and we were all on this mission together to upgrade country music technically. So I felt if you're going to charge the same money for an album it was then it should be as well made and as technically wonderful and musically wonderful as any pop album they just paid the same money for. And so that's what we set out to do.
You also raised the price that artists got paid.
Yeah.
I remember there being some screaming going on from some places. Did you hear that Bowen paid Reba $250,000 advance or something like that for your...
Yeah. You know, you have to spend money to make money. And if you treat that artist right, you can't give an artist in a royalty deal what you would like to, or what I would like to, because it's the profit from the few big sellers that you have that keeps everything running, plus gives new artists a chance to get to record. So it has to be balanced out. There's always the greedy corporation or the this or that, but it has to be a balance. But when I got to Nashville, the artist royalties were way too low. But they were only selling 50 to 100,000 albums, so that's why they were low. But when we moved to platinum and double platinum, then the artist should then move with.
How do you feel, or what do you think about it since the studios, like when they closed down Columbia Records and the studio at Columbia?
It happened out here first, Nashville and New York kind of at the same time. The union shops, the union studios destroyed themselves because the way music was made changed, but the union rules clashed with it. Nobody felt comfortable. I did a session at Capitol one time out here under the union, and I worked 2 hours to get the sound I wanted. I went to the bathroom, I came back, a new engineer came in because the other guy's time was up and he had cleared the whole board and I had to start over. Well, they killed themselves. They killed themselves because it became little studios with engineers that would work 48 hours if necessary. It became a whole different trip. And so that's just what happens as things evolve and as music evolves. When the artist got control of the music, a lot of things changed. Music got better. Music grew faster, I think. But a lot of things had to change with it.
Without, a lot of guys could go in and cut an album by themselves without the interaction from other players.
Well, a lot of music today is made one player at a time, the drums and the bass and whatever. I've never done that. So I don't have an opinion of, is it hard to do or is it fun to do? I have no desire to do that. What the great thing for me is when you've got 4 or 50 musicians together and they're playing off of each other musically, dynamically, and there's a big emotional piece of all that. To me, that's when magic happens. So I can't, I don't want to do the other, never did, and so I can't, thank God I got out before I had to do that.
Do you have a particular artist that you enjoyed working with the most out of all these years? Not like better, but just enjoyed working with better, perhaps.
Well, I guess Dean Martin would be the one overall. I was young. It was my first things that really worked. But he was just such a neat guy to work with. And most of the artists that I had any success with, I really liked them. It helps, you know, because you're really here to help. You help them get their stuff together. And I think you work a little harder, at least from the heart, if you really like the people.
Do you still get a kick out of hearing something you produced on the radio?
Oh, yeah. I think anybody that ever has any piece of what you hear on the radio is like, yeah, that's neat. I always turn them up, you know, listen to them. Yeah, you enjoy that. I never listened to much. Most of until I retired, I didn't listen to hardly any music that I wasn't working on. First of all, like in Nashville, I didn't have time to listen to music. If I'm in the car, I was listening to tapes or rough mixes or my new artist tapes or working. Since I retired, I've heard some great music. My wife plays it for me all the time. I'll go, who's that? She'll tell me. I go, boy, that's good. She thinks I'm a little off, you know, that I didn't know what was going on, but I didn't have time.
I can imagine you either mixing or looking or recording.
Well, I mentioned earlier I had a system to gather the songs, which saved a lot of time. But as all that grew, I had 4 or 5 first engineers that I could work with that either put up with or enjoyed the way I wanted it done. And we trained probably 10 second engineers. And we had just little teams that clicked, click, click, click. And I could pull into one studio and we're putting 2-part harmony on the George Strait. All right, I hear it, I tell them that's what I want. They do it. I go down the street to the next studio and I check a mix that's halfway up, then I go to do that. You can't only do one live a day if you're doing live stuff. But the live session today is the shortest time period of it all, you know. So if you set up a system where you can do it, I don't think anybody can do it again because it takes longer now to make in this new world. But for that one period of time, it worked.
Didn't you work with Conway too?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I really like. I worked with Conway in the late '50s when he had these big pop hits. We were out doing our gigs, and we crossed a few times. And then when I went to Nashville, the first label that I was wound up running was MCA, and Conway was an artist there. And I never forget, he came in to see me. Hey, how you been? I hadn't seen you in years. How you doing? We chatted a minute, and Conway looked at me and he said, well, you called the meeting. What do you want to talk about? And I said, well, Conway, I said, your record sales are on a downward spiral. I said, you haven't changed your music in 15 years at least. You hadn't even changed your hairdo in 15 years. I said, if you want to be in what's happening is what's going to happen, you got to change. And he just looked at me like this, and I had one of my head of sales that had been there for years, was dying over here. And he didn't realize what kind of relationship Conway and I had, but nonetheless, he said, well, I'll think about that. And he left, and the guy who worked for MCA said, I've never seen anything like that in my life. I said, well, he asked me, you know. And he called me up about a month later, and he said, Bowen, listen, I heard you, and I'm going to do that. Everything we talked about. I said, well, I got news for you. I'm leaving here. I don't like these people. They did something that irritated me, and I'm gone, but you're right to do that. And he did. He changed it. He had another 6-7 year career.
He did.
Record-wise.
Yeah.
Know? I found with most, if you be honest with the artist, if it's, you just hope to God you're right. But if you really tell them what you feel, if you're honest with them, they listen.
Any stories with Reba?
Oh. I had a lot of stories with Reba. We built a new office for MCA, but new offices in a goofy old building. We had like 2 or 3 floors. And I went down to check, see what was in the bottom, and I had a meeting with her. And as I'm coming back up, I got locked out of the floor I wanted on. I'm banging on that door, and finally somebody opened it. I said, "Who the blankety blank did this?" And right around the corner came Reba and that husband she had, then Charlie, the bull rider.
Right.
And I just heard a story where he'd knocked somebody through a window for cussing in front of her. And I thought, oh, Lord, this isn't going to be good. But he was cool. He held it together. And everything from then on was sort of up, you know. Yeah. Reba was smart enough to figure out what her music was in that period of time. And she parlayed it for quite a while.
So, what made you decide to call it a day?
Well, that 12 to 16 hours a day. When all that developed into mass stuff, I'd set the schedules as best I could, so I'd work for 3 months, 4 months, every day, and then I'd go to Hawaii and crash for a week or 2. Rejuvenate and come back and do the process again. It would happen like 3 times a year. And I just got burnt. In the last year and a half, I found it hard to go down there. And I knew, this is about over. And it always takes too long to wind down. We all do the same negative. I mean, once you feel that, you ought to stop. Mm-hmm. But you don't. You got too much going. And this person says, no, I need you. No. And I think just the basic, it's like that old quarterback who quits 2 years after he should have, you know. And the thing that finally did it for me, I wound up with cancer of the thyroid. And I had my thyroid removed, and I went to Hawaii to recover. And the wife and I were on the lanai having a drink one day in the evening, and I said, you know what, I'm not going back. She kind of spilled her drink and went, what? She said, well, okay, we'll go back and sell a house. I said, you didn't hear me. I'm not going back. She went back and closed everything down. That was it. But the only way you can quit music is get clear away from it.
Did you move to Hawaii?
Mm-hmm. For 6.5 years. And then I moved back to Phoenix 4.5 years ago. And I love Phoenix. It's back where I can get to places and all, but I love Hawaii too. But I was far enough away that severed it, so I get away. And I'm as we speak, I'm working on this Merle Haggard album. I always liked Merle, and we always got along good. And Tom Thacker works for him now, who went to school with me in Texas and used to work with me. And Tom asked me if I'd at least meet with Merle and see if I could help. And Merle came through Phoenix, so I did. No thought of doing anything. And after about an hour, I said, all right. But then I came out here and I got Mike Post to co-produce it with me. Mike is, I guess, the most famous composer for television ever. And Mike worked with me when he was like 19, 20 years old. We're old buddies, golf buddies. But I got Mike because I wanted a different thing for Haggard. To do another Haggard album didn't make any sense. It had to be special. And I got J.R. Robinson on drums and Lee Scalar on bass, and brought Reggie Young and Billy Joe Walker Jr. out from Nashville. Billy Joe's producing now. He doesn't play much anymore, but he came out for me, and we just had a marvel. We did 16 tracks, and it was just, after about the second track, those 4 pieces were just locked, and that was great fun. And Mike's doing some sweetening here and there, and this is Mike's studio, and I had to come out a couple weeks early to learn how to work all this new stuff. And what do you have? I said, where's the tape machine? You know, oh, it's that little thing there. Okay, you know. The first time I was doing a little rough mix, and I started to say one of the biggest waste of time always was while I waited for the tape machine to roll back. And before I could say it, he was back at the top. Just digitals, boom, there it was. Oh boy. But it's been great fun. All the new technical side of it, and when you hear the album, you hear Haggard just singing great on it. So,
let me ask you this: you said it about Sinatra. What do you think Haggard's odds are here in 2005 of getting back on country radio with this record?
Well, I'd say odds are about 70-30 against, for all the obvious reasons. But of course, I'm a little spoiled because we got Dean Martin on pop radio when the Beatles were exploding. If we capture something good enough, they'll play it. I never, ever, as a producer, lost a record that was great. You sometimes miss a little here and there, but when they happen, when they're right, somebody hears it, somebody plays it, it gets through. And if one of these would work for Haggard, then he could be one of those incredible, neat stories, you know, that happen.
That would be great.
And if it doesn't, I really don't give a damn because I'm really digging it, you know. And I won't listen to it a whole lot, so it doesn't matter.
Is there anything that you go back and listen to that for me, I have records that I constantly go back, or when they come on the radio, I feel like I did when I was 17 or 16 or whatever, again for about 3 minutes, you know. And is there music that affects you that way, that when you hear it, it takes you back and you feel that enthusiasm just like you did however many years ago?
Once in a while, if I catch an oldie station, they play Everybody Loves Somebody, there's a flash to 64 and the craziness of what all that brought on. But it's a pretty short flash because my memory's going, you know, so they're not 30 seconds, whatever you said, 3 minutes, they're flashes, you know. Nobody else's music really does that to me except Elvis. And he was a trigger to all of us back in that era.
Oh, that's what I mean. Does that, there's, you know, so it must be Elvis that you're talking about then, yeah. That's the answer to that question, that still, when you hear it, it just slams you and you just can't cut it off, you know.
Yeah, he was the only one other than somebody I worked with where that piece of music would cause me to do that.
Did you ever work with Elvis?
No. I went up to his house twice. Johnny Rivers said, "Come on, we're going up to Elvis."
Did you work with Johnny Rivers?
Yeah. Johnny was a buddy of mine. We were out here trying to get started together in '60. He come on, we're going to Elvis's house. We went up there, some beautiful women around. And then Elvis and that Memphis bunch of guys that I got to know a lot of later, and some up there. But it was just too weird a deal for me. Poor guy couldn't get out. It was like visiting a guy in jail. You know, you wanted to take him a cake with a file in it, you know. He couldn't go anywhere. Ooh, that's too much fame, you know.
What did you do with Johnny Rivers before I forget?
Oh, Johnny, when I managed Johnny Rivers for a while. I cut some, I think a single for Chancellor Records on Johnny back when he was struggling. All just before he went to Gazzari's and the Whiskey A Go-Go and made that big album. I used to get 2 o'clock in the morning, it'd be a knock on my door and there'd be Johnny. With his guitar, clothes on his hangers like this and something under his eye. He said, "I need a place to stay." 6, 8 weeks later, he'd leave. He was one of those people who's going to make it no matter what. In fact, I'm going to see him out here this week. He's writing a book about his life.
I just want to say I appreciate you, taking time out to meet me out here. This is an interview that I really wanted to do. I would have gone just about anywhere to hook up with you.
That's very nice.
And thanks again.
Great, thank you very much.